In the middle of a freezing snowstorm, a little girl in a thin pink dress clings to her unconscious mother, their figures barely visible on the icy roadside. Most would have driven past, but inside a nearby truck, a canine service dog suddenly growls, scratching at the window with urgency. His owner, a PTSD-stricken veteran, slams the brakes. Why is his dog reacting this way to strangers? What he doesn't know is that stopping tonight won't just save 2 lives. It will awaken a buried promise and change the course of his own. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country below. Let's see how far one act of kindness can go. The town of Fairhill lay buried beneath a smothering white silence. It was one of those forgotten northern towns, where winters arrived early and left late, and where the wind howled like a restless ghost down the alleys. Snow fell in thick, heavy clumps that night, muffling every sound and blurring the edges of buildings into a dreamlike haze. It was the kind of cold that made time slow down, pressing in on the lungs, seeping into the bones, and making even the bravest hearts falter. In a small log cabin just beyond the last plowed road, nestled at the edge of the frozen forest, Ethan Walker sat in the dark. 38 years old, ex-Marine, survivor of 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Syria, but more haunted than heroic. His broad shoulders, once squared with pride, now slumped beneath the weight of something invisible, something that had no name, only a presence. His face, rugged and sharply built, bore the signs of wear, a network of fine lines from too many sleepless nights, a deep scar tracing from his left brow to the edge of his cheek, and stubble that never seemed to fully disappear. His eyes, frosty blue, were the most telling part of him. They were tired eyes that had seen too much. He hadn't spoken to another human in weeks. He hadn't answered his phone in longer. Every sound startled him. Every silence taunted him. He reached for the whiskey bottle on the table, only to find it already empty. His hand lingered there, motionless. A photo frame sat just beside the glass, a younger Ethan with 2 men in uniform, grinning in desert fatigues. One of them, Daniel, had been more than a brother in arms. He'd been family. And he was gone now, blown apart in a roadside explosion Ethan would never forget, no matter how many nights he begged his brain to erase it. He rose, pulled on a worn army green parka, and turned toward the door. The snow outside was piling fast, dancing in the wind like tiny ghosts. In the corner, on a tattered blanket near the hearth, lay Ranger, 6 years old, a purebred German shepherd with a sable coat streaked in silver and black. His build was sleek but muscular, strong, alert, and quiet. Unlike most dogs, Ranger didn't beg for affection. He was a working dog, a soldier in his own right. He had seen war too, served beside Daniel first, and then Ethan after Daniel's death. In many ways, he had lost a handler too, and like Ethan, he carried grief in his silence. Tonight, Ranger stirred as Ethan reached for the truck keys. "I need air," Ethan muttered, though there was no one to hear it. "Just a drive." He didn't say goodbye. He never did. It would make leaving harder. Outside, the cold slapped him in the face. He welcomed it. Inside the truck, the heater groaned to life. The headlights pierced into a tunnel of flurries as he rolled down the winding path toward the old Miller Bridge, a rickety span of wood and rusted bolts that overlooked the frozen Blackstone River. No one went there in winter. It wasn't safe. That's why Ethan chose it. He drove in silence, each mile making the cabin behind feel less real and the end ahead feel closer. "Tonight, I don't come back," he told himself. And for the first time in a long while, the voice in his head didn't argue. Across town, in a crumbling apartment block with a broken boiler and drafty windows, Grace Thompson sat on the edge of a mattress too thin to hold warmth. Her coat was wrapped tightly around her, though it did little against the cold that seeped through the walls. She was in her early 30s, with soft features dulled by exhaustion. Her dark blonde hair, once neatly kept, now hung loose and tangled. Her green eyes, once lively, stared blankly at the floor. Grace hadn't slept well in weeks, not since the final notice arrived, the last payment missed, the landlord's threats, the power being cut. And now, the eviction that was set to become real at dawn. Beside her, curled under an old pink blanket, was Emily, her 4-year-old daughter. Tiny, fragile, and too brave for her age. Emily had inherited her mother's wide green eyes and her father's sense of quiet. She didn't cry when the heat went out. She didn't complain when dinner was only crackers. She just clutched her stuffed bunny, its ears worn and fraying, and looked out the window as if waiting for something better to show up. Grace looked down at her daughter, then up at the ceiling. "God, if you're there," she whispered, "just give me one more day, just one." There was no reply, only the sound of wind rattling the panes. Grace's thoughts wandered to Daniel, her late husband, a Marine who had died overseas. He had written her letters, full of hope, or promised he'd come home. Promised he'd build Emily a swing set in the backyard. Promised they'd grow old together. Now she was alone, and the promises were ashes. After Daniel's death, she had trusted Richard, Daniel's cousin, to help handle the insurance money. He said he'd manage the paperwork, protect the account, make the investments. Instead, he drained it. One lie at a time, one wire transfer after another, until there was nothing. Grace never told Daniel's unit, never reached out. She carried the shame like a second coat. Now, eviction loomed like a cliff edge. She knew tomorrow, she and Emily would be on the street. She had no family left. No car, no savings. Only the pink dress Emily insisted on wearing to sleep every night, because Daddy bought it for me. Grace brushed her daughter's hair away from her face and kissed her forehead. "Sleep, baby. Tomorrow, we'll figure it out." But she had no plan. She didn't even know if they'd make it through the storm. Back on the road, Ethan's hands gripped the wheel tighter. The snow was relentless now, and visibility was nearly gone. But he didn't slow down. He didn't care if he crashed. His eyes, hollow and dry, stared ahead as the wooden railing of Miller Bridge finally came into view. He pulled over, left the engine running, opened the door. Ranger looked up, but didn't move. The dog knew. Somehow, he always knew. Ethan stepped out, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He walked to the edge of the bridge, staring down into the white void. The wind howled around him. The world faded. His breath caught. His heart slowed. And for a moment, just one long moment, Ethan Walker felt ready to disappear. The snow kept falling like ash from a dying sky. Flakes swirled and danced under the high beams of the old Bronco as it crept slowly over the iced timber of Miller Bridge. Ethan Walker's hands tightened around the wheel, knuckles white, breath shallow. The engine groaned against the cold, as if it too could sense the weight of what was to come. Ranger sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his head turned toward the window, his breath fogging the glass. His ears were rigid, eyes locked forward, nostrils twitching like he had caught a scent that didn't belong. Ethan noticed the tension ripple down the dog's back. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and weary. And then it came. A deep guttural bark. One bark, two, then three, fast and urgent. Ranger clawed at the window, shifting wildly in the seat, his entire body coiled with intent. "Ranger! Hey!" Ethan hit the brakes out of reflex. The truck skidded slightly, tires crunching into a thick bank of snow. Before he could say another word, Ranger pushed his weight against the door, pawing at the handle. Ethan leaned across, popped the latch, and the dog leapt out into the storm. "Damn it!" Ethan threw the truck into park and stumbled out into the night. Wind tore at his coat, snow slashed across his face, and visibility dropped to nearly nothing. But Ranger was already ahead, a blur of fur against the white, sprinting down the shoulder of the bridge like a creature chasing fate itself. "Ranger, stop!" No use. The dog didn't stop until he reached the other end of the bridge, where the road bent into a narrow curve, flanked by an embankment and a few leafless trees, bowed low with ice. And that's when Ethan saw it. Two figures, small, still, crumpled into the snow like discarded dolls. He hurried forward, boots crunching. Ranger stood beside the shapes, tail low, ears back. He whined, a rare, mournful sound. Ethan's heart twisted. The first figure was a child, a little girl, no older than 4, wearing a pink dress that clung to her small frame like a second skin, soaked through and nearly frozen. Her legs were bare, her arms wrapped tightly around the second figure, a woman. The woman lay motionless, half buried in the snow, her head tilted back against the embankment, her dark blonde hair matted with frost. Her skin was pale, lips blue, eyes closed. She wore no gloves, no hat, only a thin sweater and jeans soaked with slush. Ethan dropped to one knee. The girl looked up. Her eyes were green, huge and filled with confusion, framed by frozen lashes. "Mommy's not talking," she whispered. Her voice cracked like old glass. Ranger leaned in, sniffing the woman's face, then nudged her shoulder with his snout. No response. Ethan peeled off his gloves. He pressed 2 fingers gently to the woman's neck. A pulse, faint, fluttering like a trapped bird. But there. He turned back to the girl. "What's your name?" She blinked. "Emily." "Emily," he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to get you warm now. Can you hold on to me?" She nodded silently, arms trembling. He lifted her first, wrapping his thick parka around her small frame. She clung to him instinctively, her face buried in his shoulder. Then he moved to the mother. She was heavier than she looked, but Ethan had carried men through gunfire. He adjusted her over his shoulder and turned toward the truck, Ranger close on his heels. When they reached the Bronco, Ethan opened the back seat and gently placed the mother across it. She didn't stir. He set Emily beside her and covered them both with emergency blankets from the trunk, old army issue, wool-lined, and smelling faintly of gun oil and cedar. Ranger climbed in last, wedging himself between the seats, placing his head on Emily's lap. She gripped his fur without a word. Ethan slammed the door shut and got behind the wheel. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the key. The engine coughed and roared to life. He turned the heat to full blast. He sat there for a second, listening to the wind rage against the windows. The plan, the bridge, the end, it all faded, replaced by 2 fragile lives in his truck, clinging to the last embers of warmth. He pulled a U-turn and drove toward the cabin. Back in town, Mrs. Hendricks, the landlady of the crumbling Fairhill Apartments, stared out her frost-lined window with pursed lips and narrowed eyes. A heavy-set woman in her late 60s, with frizzy gray hair pulled into a bun and skin weathered like old leather, she'd always taken a hard line with her tenants. "Rent is rent," she liked to say. "You don't pay, you don't stay." When she'd evicted Grace Thompson and her daughter earlier that day, she'd barely flinched. Grace had begged for a few more nights, said she had nowhere to go. "You should have thought of that before living rent-free for 3 months, Hendricks snapped. "I run a business, not a charity." The snow had already been falling then. She didn't care. People like Grace, she thought, always had a way of surviving. And if not, well, that wasn't her problem. 20 minutes later, Ethan reached his cabin. He parked beside the porch and rushed around to the back seat. Emily was drowsy now, cheeks flushed with a strange mix of frost and relief. The mother was still unconscious, her breath shallow but more even now. He carried them both inside. The cabin smelled of pine, burnt wood, and quiet desperation. He placed the woman on the couch by the fireplace and gently laid Emily down beside her, wrapping them in every blanket he had. Ranger stood at the hearth, watching silently. Ethan knelt, feeding logs into the fire. Flames roared to life, casting gold light across the small room. He looked at the 2 strangers now sleeping in his home, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel alone. The fire had burned low by the time Grace Thompson stirred. Faint light flickered along the pinewood walls of the cabin, casting tall, wavering shadows across the floor. The air was warmer now, filled with the scent of smoke, wool blankets, and something faintly wild, Ranger's fur. Ethan sat in the old rocking chair a few feet from the couch, elbows on his knees, hands laced together. He hadn't moved in over an hour. He watched the fire, occasionally glancing toward the 2 figures bundled on the couch. Emily had fallen asleep quickly, one small arm curled tightly around Ranger's neck like a child gripping a guardian angel. The dog hadn't shifted since. His golden amber eyes remained half open, ears alert, chin resting on Emily's leg. It was that loyalty Ethan understood, that quiet, steady presence that spoke more than words ever could. Grace coughed softly, then flinched. Her eyes opened slowly, the green dulled by fever and confusion. Her lips were dry and cracked, and her brow damp with sweat. She sat up too quickly and winced, her hand going instinctively to her side. "You're safe," Ethan said, voice low and gruff, not looking directly at her. "You're in my home. Don't move too fast." Grace's gaze darted around the room, taking in the fire, the thick quilts, the shadows of antlers mounted over the fireplace. "Where's Emily?" "She's fine," Ethan nodded toward the girl. "Sleeping. She hasn't let go of him since we picked you up." Grace followed his eyes to the large German shepherd curled beside her daughter. Her breath caught. "Is that your dog?" Ethan nodded. "What's his name?" "Ranger." "Ranger," she repeated, voice catching slightly. Like a soldier." Ethan didn't answer that. The word hung between them like something too familiar to say out loud. She pulled the blanket tighter around her. "I thought we were going to die." "You almost did." She looked away. "I'm sorry you found us like that." "You don't have to be sorry for surviving." Silence. Just the crackle of wood and the soft wind brushing the windows. Grace looked down at her hands. Her fingers were red and swollen from the cold, nails chipped, knuckles bruised. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. "My landlord gave us until morning. I thought maybe we could wait the storm out in that little alley off Hollow Creek. I didn't think it would be this bad." Ethan remained quiet, his eyes never leaving the fire. Grace studied him, his rigid posture, the way he seemed to fold inward even as he sat upright. A man built for war but broken by it. His features were harsh, angular, but handsome in a weathered way. His skin was pale with a sunken quality, and his eyes never held direct contact long enough to feel real. It was like talking to someone only half present. "You live alone?" He nodded once. "No family?" "Not anymore." "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "It is what it is." There was another pause, but this one felt less like silence and more like fragile ground they didn't want to tread. Grace leaned her head back against the couch. "Emily's father, he was a Marine. Daniel, he didn't come home." Ethan's jaw clenched slightly. The name pulled at a thread inside him, but he didn't speak. He always said he wanted her to grow up somewhere with a backyard and stars she could see without a city blocking them. We never got there. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. After he died, things fell apart. The military covered the funeral, gave us what they could, but Daniel's cousin Richard offered to handle the hard stuff: paperwork, savings, insurance. Ethan's eyes flicked toward her. "Did he?" he asked quietly. Grace gave a bitter laugh. "He handled it all right, handled it straight into his own pocket." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Ranger stirred beside Emily, one ear twitching. "I tried to fight it," she continued, "but legal aid wouldn't take the case, and I didn't have the records. By the time I realized what he'd done, I was already behind on rent. Emily got sick. I sold the car. I lost my job when I couldn't find childcare. And then the eviction came." She didn't cry. Her voice was steady, numb. "I didn't mean to end up like that. On the street, in the snow." "No one ever means to," Ethan murmured. Grace looked down at Emily, still sleeping peacefully, her tiny fingers tangled in Ranger's thick coat. That's the first time she slept soundly in weeks. Ranger shifted then, lifting his head. His golden eyes locked onto Grace's. She froze. He stepped forward slowly, carefully, placing one heavy paw on the edge of the couch. Then, with calm deliberation, he leaned his head down and pressed his chin gently into the palm of her hand. Grace inhaled sharply, startled by the intimate gesture. Ethan stood suddenly, his eyes wide. "That's—" he started, his voice unsteady. "He doesn't do that with strangers." Grace looked at the dog, bewildered. "What is he doing?" "That's something I trained into him during the second tour," Ethan said. "Only with people he trusts, people he recognizes." "But I've never—" she began, then stopped. A thought struck her. She looked back at Ranger, who held still, chin nestled in her hand, eyes calm and knowing. He knew Daniel, didn't he? Ethan sat down again, slower this time. Yes, Ranger was Daniel's first handler. They served together. After he died, Ranger was reassigned to me. We bonded. Neither of us really had a choice. Grace said nothing, her fingers unconsciously curling into Ranger's warm fur. Ethan looked away, his throat thick. They sat there like that for a long time. No more stories, no more confessions. Just a man, a woman, a sleeping child, and a war dog that remembered everything. The fire had died down to embers, glowing soft orange in the belly of the old hearth. Outside, the wind still whispered through the snow-draped trees, brushing against the cabin's wood like a memory that refused to be forgotten. Inside, silence stretched between Ethan and Grace like a chasm carved by years of grief and unsaid truths. Grace sat on the worn couch, a quilt draped around her shoulders, her hands still resting on Ranger's thick fur. The dog had curled beside her again, calm but alert, his golden eyes occasionally flicking up to Ethan. Emily remained asleep near the hearth, her small breaths even and rhythmic. Ethan stood by the window, one arm braced against the frame. He didn't know how long he'd been watching the snowfall. Minutes, maybe longer. The name had been echoing in his head since the last chapter of Silence ended. Daniel. The way Grace had said it, not like a memory, but like a wound that hadn't closed. He turned around slowly. "What's your full name?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. Grace blinked, startled. "Sorry? Your last name?" he said, still standing. "What is it?" She hesitated, eyes searching his. "It's Thompson. Grace Thompson." Ethan froze. It wasn't the kind of freeze that happens from cold, but the kind where your whole past rushes back in one sharp, undeniable punch. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. His knees felt suddenly unsure beneath him, as if the world had shifted beneath the wood floor. "Daniel Thompson," he said, the name breaking off at the end like a crack in his chest. Grace looked up. Her eyes widened. You knew him?" "I served with him," Ethan replied, voice rough. "2 tours, Kandahar and Helmand. He was my bunkmate, my closest friend out there. We lived through hell together. Then one day, I didn't." She sat straighter, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "You're Sergeant Ethan Walker?" He nodded once. "Danny wrote about you," she said softly, "in his letters. Said you were like a brother. That if anything ever happened, he hoped you'd get out. That you'd take care of Ranger." Ethan's eyes dropped to the dog, still lying between them like the last living thread of a life they had both lost. "I did," he whispered. "I buried him with my own hands. There was nothing left to bring home. Just Ranger. He stayed by the crater for hours after. Wouldn't leave. I don't even remember the helicopter ride. Just Ranger's eyes. They never left mine." Grace's breath hitched. "I never knew what really happened. They told me he died instantly. There were no remains to send." Ethan nodded, slowly crossing the room. He sat down on the edge of the armchair nearest her, still not meeting her eyes. "There wasn't much to send, but I kept something." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a leather wallet, faded, cracked. Inside, he slipped out a photo, edges worn, corners curled from years of being handled. He passed it to her without a word. Grace took it carefully, as if it might crumble. In the photo, 3 figures stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a dusty Humvee, helmets off, smiles half exhausted, half proud. Daniel was in the middle, younger. His light brown hair buzzed short, freckles faint across his nose, blue eyes bright. Ethan stood on the left, slightly taller, leaner than. Ranger sat at their feet, smaller and younger but unmistakable, his tongue out, his posture alert. Her fingers trembled as she traced Daniel's face. "That was his laugh," she murmured. "Right there, he always smiled with his whole face." Ethan finally looked up. "He talked about you every night. Every letter you sent, he read it out loud. Said Emily kicked in your belly during a thunderstorm, and he knew she'd be brave." Grace gave a shaky laugh through the tears that welled in her eyes. She was. She still is. They sat in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but full of shared absence, of memories that had no place in the world anymore. Ranger, sensing something had shifted, moved closer, placing his head gently in Grace's lap again. Ethan looked at her for a long time. "I didn't know where you were. I asked after we got back. They said the family moved. No one left to contact. I thought maybe you wanted to forget." "I never wanted to forget," Grace said, wiping her eyes. I didn't know how to survive. I was drowning. And then Richard, Daniel trusted him. So did I." Ethan's jaw clenched. "He stole from you." "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. "Everything. Insurance, savings. I was too slow to act, too trusting. By the time I realized what he was doing, it was too late." Ethan stood and began to pace slowly. "That bastard." Grace nodded. "I couldn't prove it, and I didn't have the strength to fight. I just tried to raise Emily with what I had, but it kept getting worse. Every time I tried to pull us up, Another part of the world collapsed under me. "I'm sorry," Ethan said after a long moment, "for all of it. I should have found you." "You saved us tonight," Grace replied. "That's enough." Ethan sat again, leaned forward, elbows on knees. "No, not if that's all I do. Daniel made me promise. If anything happened to him, I was to make sure you were okay. You and Emily. I didn't keep that promise. You are now." They looked at each other, really looked, for the first time. Something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. Two people carrying the same weight, finally able to put it down for just a moment. Emily stirred, murmuring something unintelligible before turning onto her side, still hugging Ranger close. Ethan exhaled. "I don't know how to fix this, but I can't ignore it anymore." "Neither can I." He looked at the fire. The embers glowed steady now. Not burning, but not fading either. "We'll start tomorrow," he said. Grace nodded, gently tucking the photo beside her heart. Tomorrow. The morning broke gray and heavy. The sky above the pines still hung with remnants of the storm. Snow blanketed everything in a clean, deceptive stillness. The kind of hush that felt like the world was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the smell of percolated coffee mingled with the faint aroma of burnt toast. Ethan stood at the counter, sleeves rolled to the forearms of his thermal shirt, staring down at the coffee mug in his hand, like it held more answers than caffeine. His eyes were distant, jaw tight. Behind him, the low murmur of the fire and the soft creak of floorboards signaled life slowly returning to the space. Grace sat at the small kitchen table, still wrapped in a wool blanket, her hands curled around a steaming mug. Her eyes were puffy, lashes damp, but she was awake now, awake in more ways than just conscious. Emily was still curled up on the couch, Ranger resting beside her like a statue of warm fur and patience. "I need to tell you something," Grace said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched since dawn. Ethan glanced over but didn't speak. He set the mug down and leaned against the counter, arms folded across his chest. Grace inhaled deeply, then exhaled through trembling lips. "After Daniel died, I didn't know how to live anymore. I mean, he was everything. I had a newborn and no plan. The grief was like walking underwater. Every breath felt like a betrayal." He nodded slightly. He knew that feeling all too well. "Richard was there almost immediately," she continued. "Daniel's cousin. Older by maybe 10 years. He was charming, supportive, said he'd help me handle the finances so I could focus on Emily." "What did you give him access to?" Ethan asked, though he already had a guess. "Everything," she admitted, voice bitter. "I gave him power of attorney, trusted him to manage the life insurance, the savings Daniel left. He said he was investing it, said he was protecting Emily's future." Ethan's brows furrowed. And he wasn't. "No. At first, it looked fine. Statements were coming in. He'd bring printouts, tell me we were secure, but within a year, things started slipping. I asked questions. He got defensive, then he stopped answering calls. When I finally got a lawyer to look into it, the accounts were drained, transferred, and I had nothing left to prove what was mine." "Did you press charges?" "I tried, but the lawyer said without the original documents, signed agreements, bank records, I had no case. Richard claimed everything was gifted, said Daniel asked him to manage it privately. He spun it into a family favor." Ethan's fists clenched against his arms. "Did you go to anyone in the unit? Military support groups?" "I couldn't," Grace whispered. "How could I face the men who fought beside him and say I'd failed him, that I let someone steal what he died for?" She looked up then, tears welling again. "I felt like I lost him all over again, and I didn't deserve help." Ethan pushed off the counter, grabbing the phone from the wall. "You were grieving. You trusted someone who took advantage of that. That's not failure. That's betrayal. There's a difference." He paced a few steps, then hesitated. "There's someone I want to call. She might be able to help." Grace looked up. "Who?" "Sarah Jenkins, retired Navy. She served in legal operations, JAG, runs pro bono work for vets and their families now. Helped me once, back when I came home and had to fight for my benefits." He dialed, then paused with the phone to his ear. "She's sharp, doesn't tolerate bullshit." After a few rings, someone picked up. A brisk, confident voice answered. "Jenkins?" Ethan allowed himself the faintest smile. Still don't say hello, huh? Ethan Walker, the voice said. Haven't heard that grunt growl in a while. What's the damage? He glanced at Grace. It's not for me. It's about Daniel Thompson's widow. She's here. She and her kid got thrown out into a snowstorm. Turns out her cousin drained all her finances. Life insurance, savings. We've got a potential case of theft and fraud. A pause. Is she with you now? She is. All right, Sarah said. I'm not making promises, but I'll hear her out. What's the situation with paperwork? Ethan looked at Grace. She shook her head slowly, regret weighing down her expression. No documents, he said. Everything's gone. Tell her unless we can prove power of attorney abuse or fraudulent transfer, we're going to be swinging blind. It's her word against his, and that won't hold unless we get something. Anything. Understood. I'll prep a file. If you find anything, call me back. We'll take it from there. Thanks, Sarah. You owe me coffee, she said, then hung up. Ethan placed the phone back on the receiver. Well? Grace asked, voice tight with cautious hope. She'll help, Ethan said, but we need proof. Something with Richard's name, bank transfers, a power of attorney document, a signed anything. Grace's face fell. They're gone, all of them. After Emily got sick last year, we moved twice, lost a whole box of records in storage. I think it got thrown out. Ethan shook his head. Maybe, but maybe not. She blinked. What do you mean? Sometimes the past hides where we stopped looking. If there's even a chance you still have that box, we find it. The snow had lightened by midday, trading its earlier fury for a steady, quiet drift that softened the landscape like a funeral shroud. Ethan stood in the open doorway of his Bronco, the cold air stinging his cheeks as he scanned the edge of the Fairhill storage lot. The facility sat on the outskirts of town, half forgotten like everything else in this part of Montana, just a strip of concrete and corrugated steel buildings flanked by dead pine and rusted chain-link fences. The padlock on the gate clinked weakly in the wind, more for show than security. Beside him stood two men, grizzled, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably military, even in civilian clothes. On Ethan's left was Raymond Ray McConnell, mid-40s, thick-necked with a shaved head and a crooked smile that usually hinted at sarcasm, but today was absent. Ray had served with Ethan and Daniel back in their first deployment, a combat medic turned diesel mechanic who now owned a body shop in Butte. He wore a leather bomber jacket, jeans, and steel-toed boots, and he carried himself with a relaxed readiness that only came from surviving the worst. On the other side stood Luis Navarro, younger, as around 33, with sun-worn skin, jet-black hair pulled into a neat ponytail, and a clean beard. Luis had been their comms guy in Helmand, a quiet presence with sharp eyes and the steady patience of a man who listened more than he spoke. He now worked for a veterans outreach program, but dropped everything the moment Ethan called. "So this is the place?" Ray asked, peering at the nearest row of units. Ethan nodded. Grace said she had to clear out a few months ago. Stuff got dumped here by the landlord's guys. She thinks the storage company kept it, but hasn't been able to pay for access. "Let's hope they haven't tossed it," Luis said, pulling a crowbar from the truck bed. "Or burned it for firewood." They stepped inside the office, where a tired-looking woman in her 60s sat behind a smudged plexiglass window. She had deep crow's feet, a thick flannel shirt, and a voice like gravel soaked in bourbon. Her name tag read Marla. Ethan explained the situation, adding enough military history to stir sympathy. Marla sighed and waved a hand. "Unit 17B, still unpaid, but I didn't auction it off. Something about that box made me feel like it wasn't junk. You've got 30 minutes. "Thank you, ma'am," Ethan said, and meant it. The three men stepped into the storage corridor, where the cold bit deeper. The metal walls echoed every step like a distant drumbeat. They reached the unit and pried it open. Inside was chaos. Boxes stacked haphazardly, some already collapsing under their own weight. A broken child's crib lay against the back wall, along with a cracked mirror, old suitcases, and moldy cardboard bins spilling out baby clothes, kitchen utensils, and damp books. Ray let out a long whistle. "This is gonna be fun." They got to work. Ethan checking the far corner, Ray breaking down boxes by the entrance, and Luis carefully combing through the center. Dust clung to their gloves, and every so often, a moth or mouse darted out from behind something forgotten. Most of it was unsalvageable. I'm guessing Richard wasn't exactly the archiving type, Ray muttered, shaking his head over a box full of shredded tax documents. Luis pulled out a small photo album. There's family stuff here. Look, Grace and Daniel, right before deployment. Emily is a newborn. Ethan took the album. There was Daniel, arms wrapped around Grace, a rare softness in his usually squared expression. His hand rested gently on her belly. Ethan's throat caught as he turned the page. Another picture, Daniel holding an infant Emily. He looked proud, exhausted, whole. A gust of wind slipped through the door. They'd been searching for over 40 minutes, their hands numbing, their hope dwindling. Ray stretched his back. We might be too late, man. Luis shook his head. We checked the rest. There's still that corner with the old crib. Before Ethan could respond, Ranger, who had been quietly sitting just outside the unit, suddenly stood. His ears perked, and he let out a single sharp bark. Then another. Ethan looked up. What is it, boy? Ranger trotted inside, nose low to the ground. He passed the men and made straight for a collapsed pile near the far wall, half covered by an old tarp and warped from water damage. He sniffed once, then again, then began to paw at a battered cardboard box sealed with layers of dusty tape. Ray raised an eyebrow. Well, hell, I guess it's his turn now. Ethan crossed the room and knelt beside Ranger. The box was stained, one corner torn. He peeled the tape off slowly, then opened the flaps. Inside, wrapped in a threadbare towel, lay a stack of files, crumpled but dry in the center. Manila folders, a zippered pouch, an envelope marked Daniel Legal. Ethan's hands shook. He opened the pouch first. Inside were photocopies of the power of attorney form signed by Grace and witnessed by a notary. A separate sheet bore Richard's signature. Then the envelope. Insurance documents, beneficiary assignments, Daniel's original will, unsigned but included, and most importantly, a copy of the original bank deposit showing the first transfer into a joint account managed by Richard Thompson. Ray let out a long breath. Jesus, you hit gold. Luis leaned closer. She wasn't crazy. She was just buried by all of this. Ethan nodded slowly, emotion rising in his throat. Ranger sat beside him, tail thumping once against the ground. You just bought her a second chance, Ethan murmured, rubbing the dog's ear. They packed everything into a duffel, wrapping the folders in plastic to protect them. As they locked up the unit again, snow began to fall harder, fat flakes drifting in lazy spirals from the sky. Let's get this to Sarah, Ethan said, determination in his voice. We're not done yet. The courthouse in Fairhill was small and plain, its red brick walls dulled by years of snow and sun. The brass letters above the arched entrance faded but still legible. Inside, the heat clanked through an aging radiator system, making the whole place sound like it was breathing with exhaustion. Yet, on this morning, there was a hum in the air, anticipation, quiet tension, and the low murmurs of veterans who had come not for war, but for justice. Ethan sat on the left bench near the back, wearing a clean black jacket over a pressed white shirt. His jaw was set, his hands calm, but his eyes stayed on the woman seated near the front of the room, Grace Thompson. Her hair was pulled into a neat twist, and though her face still bore the signs of wear, there was something different about her now. Her posture was straighter, her eyes sharper. Her lips no longer curled in worry, but firm with purpose. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and was still burning with quiet strength. Beside her sat Sarah Jenkins, their attorney. In her early 40s, Sarah was tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones, dark brown skin, and coiled black hair clipped into a no-nonsense bun. She wore a navy suit that matched the directness of her gaze. Her presence commanded attention not with volume, but with clarity. Sarah had once been the kind of Navy officer who could make a full room stand just by walking in. Now, she used that energy in court, her voice cutting through red tape like a blade honed by service. Across the room, sitting stiffly at the defendant's table, was Richard Thompson. Early 50s, silver at the temples, and dressed in an expensive wool coat, he carried the smug confidence of someone used to getting his way. But his hands were tight on his briefcase, his smile too polished. His lawyer, a younger man with thinning hair and a nervous tick in his left eye, whispered rapidly as Richard kept glancing over his shoulder toward Ethan, then Sarah, then Grace. The judge, Walter Monroe, was a stocky man in his late 60s with a thick gray mustache and deep-set eyes that had seen decades of excuses. He was known around Fairhill for being fair but blunt, a no-nonsense type who didn't tolerate theatrics. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the folder in front of him. "Miss Jenkins," he said, "you may proceed." Sarah stood, collected, and began. Her words weren't emotional. They were exact. She detailed the timeline, the transfer of power of attorney, the fraudulent signatures, the missing funds. With each page she handed to the judge, the courtroom air thickened. Ethan could feel the shift in posture from the men behind him, fellow veterans, community members who had come to support Grace. Not because she asked, but because one of their own had been betrayed, and this was their way of standing guard. Grace didn't testify for long. When she did, her voice was steady, recounting not only the legal deception, but the human cost. Losing her home, sleeping in the cold, shielding her daughter from hunger with her own body. "She didn't cry that night," Grace said softly. "Emily just kept asking if Daddy had left us another blanket. She doesn't understand betrayal, but she understands cold." Richard's lawyer made a short rebuttal, arguing that the money had been managed according to Daniel's verbal wishes, that nothing had been stolen, that Grace had given access willingly. But the document spoke louder. The final blow came when Sarah produced the original deposit slips and emails recovered from the box in storage, each line item traced directly to Richard's personal accounts. It took Judge Monroe less than 10 minutes to issue a verdict. The court finds in favor of Miss Grace Thompson. Full restitution ordered, along with financial penalties for breach of fiduciary duty and intentional misrepresentation. Furthermore, Mr. Thompson is to be investigated for potential criminal charges by the district attorney's office. Court adjourned. The gavel fell. Ethan hadn't realized he was holding his breath until then. Grace stood frozen for a moment before Sarah leaned in and whispered, "It's done." Grace nodded, tears brimming but not falling. This wasn't a moment for weeping. It was a moment to stand tall. Later that week, a new chapter began. The veterans in the area, led by Ray and Luis, had banded together. They found a small apartment just a few blocks from the elementary school, a modest 2-bedroom in a building run by an old Marine named Hal Parker. Hal was in his 70s, built like a retired bulldozer, with a limp from shrapnel and a heart like a furnace. He waived the deposit, fixed the heater himself, and even replaced the front lock without being asked. "Vets take care of our own," Hal grunted when Grace tried to thank him. "Just raise that girl right." The moving day was something out of another life. Men in old flannel shirts and military jackets argued over who got to carry the heaviest furniture. Luis brought boxes of groceries. Ray replaced every light bulb. Even Ethan, who usually avoided crowds like landmines, stayed the entire day, hauling shelves and quietly fixing a window frame. Emily watched it all in awe, a little whirlwind in a red sweater and wool socks, darting between rooms, her stuffed bunny trailing behind her. And always, Ranger was there. He had become her shadow. She fed him Cheerios from a cup, built him a bed made of pillows in the living room, and insisted he get his own spot at the dining table. He followed her through each room, his tail swishing gently, his eyes never leaving her unless she slept. In the evenings, the apartment filled with warmth. Grace cooking in the kitchen, Ethan helping with minor repairs, Emily giggling as Ranger hid behind furniture far too small for him. One night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Ethan stood by the doorway with Grace. The snow outside had returned, but inside was a glow, light on the walls, laughter in the air, the distant hum of a radio. "You did it," he said. "No," Grace replied, leaning gently against the doorframe. "We did." And in the corner of the room, Ranger lifted his head as if he understood every word. The sky above Fairhill was the color of pearl, soft and vast, and streaked with faint sunlight pushing through thin clouds. The snow had stopped sometime in the early morning, leaving behind a shimmering world of white and silver. On the porch of a quiet 2-bedroom apartment, Ethan Walker stood alone, gloved hands tucked into the deep pockets of his worn military jacket, eyes resting on the small fenced yard below. Emily was out there, bundled in a blue winter coat 2 sizes too big, her cheeks flushed pink with cold, laughter rising like steam into the air. She ran circles through the snow, shrieking with joy as Ranger, tongue out, ears perked, chased her in wide loops, careful never to outrun her, but always close enough to make it a game. The dog's coat shone in the light, sable and silver, almost noble, like a wolf softened by kindness. His tail wagged in slow, happy arcs, and when Emily collapsed into a heap of snow, Ranger collapsed beside her, his massive head resting gently on her legs. From the window behind Ethan, the scent of cinnamon and something buttery drifted outward. In the kitchen, Grace was humming a quiet tune as she moved between the stove and the countertop, sleeves rolled up, her hair pinned back with a wooden clip. The light caught her just right, golden and warm, her skin glowing softly, eyes focused but peaceful. She looked nothing like the woman Ethan had pulled from a snowbank only weeks before. And that, he thought, was the miracle of it all. How fast things could grow again, how healing didn't come all at once, but in layers, quiet moments of warmth after storms. He let his gaze drift back to the yard. Emily had made a snow angel. Ranger stood over it now, guarding it with the seriousness of a royal monument. The girl giggled and threw a handful of snow at his nose. Ranger blinked but didn't flinch. Instead, he pawed the air once and flopped down dramatically, earning a squeal of delight from Emily. Ethan smiled, genuinely, fully, for the first time in years. He had come close to ending everything. He remembered the bridge, the darkness, the quiet he had mistaken for peace. And yet, here he stood, heart steady, feet grounded, not with guilt, but with a sense of something new. Not survival, not penance, but purpose. A memory stirred, Daniel's voice laughing across a campfire. "If anything happens, promise me you'll watch over them, all right? Grace doesn't ask for help, but she'll need it. And the kid, she'll have my eyes. Don't let them go it alone." At the time, it had felt like just another pact between soldiers, something said under stars with dirt in their boots and rifles in their hands. But it hadn't been a pact. It had been a bridge, one Daniel built that Ethan would one day have to cross. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, the one he always carried. The three of them, dust-covered and smiling, Ranger at their feet. The edges were worn smooth, the colors faded, but the memory was clear. And now, the people in it weren't just memory. They were family. "Hey!" Grace's voice called from behind him. "Coffee's hot!" He turned, eyes soft. "Yeah, I'll be in, just watching." She stepped beside him, leaning against the doorframe, a steaming mug in hand. She wore a loose cream sweater and faded jeans, her feet tucked into thick socks. "You've been out here a while?" "I needed to see it," he said, nodding toward the yard. She followed his gaze. "You mean her." "And him," Ethan added, watching Ranger nudge Emily toward the porch. "He never gave up, even when I did." Grace handed him the coffee, her fingers brushing his. "You didn't give up? You paused. That's different." He took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest. "Feels like I've been running from ghosts for years." "Then maybe," she said, resting her head briefly on his shoulder, "this is the place where the ghosts don't follow." They stood there for a long while, not speaking, just sharing the stillness. Inside, the living room was filled with soft blankets and a handmade wooden shelf Luis had built from reclaimed lumber. Ray had dropped off a refurbished space heater that sat humming beside the couch. There were signs of life now. Children's books stacked on the windowsill, drawings on the fridge, muddy boot prints by the door. And Ranger's bed, technically Emily's collection of couch cushions, had become his official post near the fire. That night, after Emily had been tucked in with a kiss and Ranger posted himself like a sentry beside her bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a pen in hand. He wrote a letter, not because anyone had asked for one, but because it was time. "Daniel, it took longer than I expected, but I found them. Grace is stronger than anyone gave her credit for. Emily's got your eyes, and your stubbornness. I don't think I've earned this peace, but I'm here. Ranger never forgot her. He never forgot you. And somehow, he remembered what I couldn't. You were right to trust him. You were right to trust me. I kept the promise. We both did." He folded the letter and placed it under the photo frame on the mantel. No fanfare, no flag, just truth. As he turned out the lights, he passed Ranger one last time, kneeling beside the dog. The shepherd opened one eye, then closed it again, his head still on his paws. "You kept us alive, brother," Ethan whispered. You brought us home. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, light, slow, peaceful. It no longer felt like an end. It felt like a beginning. Sometimes, God doesn't speak in thunder or light, but in the soft steps of a dog through the snow, in a child's laughter on a winter morning, in the quiet courage of a mother who refuses to give up. This story wasn't just about a soldier, a widow, or a dog. It was about redemption, the kind that sneaks in through the cracks of a broken heart and reminds us that no promise is ever truly lost when it's kept in love. Perhaps the real miracle is not in fire from the heavens, but in the warmth of a home rebuilt, in the bond between a little girl and a battle-worn dog, in the whisper that tells us, you're not alone. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. Tell us about a moment when you felt God placed someone or something on your path to guide you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join our growing family of hope. And may the Lord bless you and your loved ones with light in every season, even the coldest winter. Amen.